I was asking the fad that is these days in moderating, which is to ask GPT-4, what is the dominant narrative in the world? Why is it that the Americans own all the platforms? Is it that the programming that is done even on AIs is being done by companies that are controlled by the Americans? And what, if at all, are the alternative narratives that are even remotely challenging the American narrative? And therefore the concept of storytelling. And I got some answers, but I'll probably turn to Lara, who has the vantage point of having worked as a star in the American media space and now in Armenia. Do you agree at all that the world narrative is continually controlled by the Americans? And if so, why?
I think every new narrative now is challenging that hegemony. And I live in a tiny country, a very small country, but I think it is for the smaller countries to reclaim their story and their narrative identity. This is that time. Every digital tool available now is a challenge to the dominant narrative. And I think that's very important. We see it in news, we see it in film, and it's beautiful, frankly.
So who knows the Armenian narrative? I mean, it's all very well to say nice things, but may I challenge you straight away?
You can challenge me. Look, I think I feel very blessed to be coming to this conversation from Armenia. There's genius work that's being done there to reclaim our heritage, to enliven it through digital platforms. And I think it's a great case study, frankly, in reclaiming one's narrative. 23andMe tells me that my family's been living in that little plot of land for 47,000 years. That's a lot of narrative. That's a lot of stories. And what I'm seeing now is that every digital tool available is, and frankly, platforms like Cuisine. Everything now is a platform. Cuisine is a platform. Music is a platform. Armenians love being who they are, and they are finding new ways to express it. One of my favorite bands is teenagers playing ancient instruments. I call it Young People Play Old Instruments. And it's amazing. So you see the next generation picking up every opportunity to express who they are. 3D modeling of ancient churches and monasteries, calligraphy through graphic design. I see it everywhere, and I think it's very
encouraging. Is it what people sometimes say PLUs, people like us, which is essentially the Armenians talking to each other a lot more cohesively?
The first thing is telling yourself your own story and not hearing it from somebody else. But I see, this goes global. Rosalind goes from the Eurovision stage, from Armenia to the Eurovision stage to Los Angeles and becomes a global superstar. So I think it's the opportunity to be generative, not in the AI sense, but to be generative in a way that your content, your narrative, your excellence can be picked up.
So there is hope.
There's tons of hope.
Okay, so Lukhanyo, I'll turn to you, sir. Have I got your name right?
Yeah.
And what does it mean?
English is not helpful in that regard.
Correct.
But
precisely.
It is light, there is light in that direction, but not too helpful in English. Perhaps let's reject the idea of an American archive, right? And especially as someone who is from the African continent, the idea of the Black Atlantic, the taking of slaves from East Africa, West Africa, has meant that our cultures have become embedded in America. So I think it's so easy to want to surrender our own archive and say it's an American archive when we spend so many centuries building this archive. We shouldn't just surrender it to them. But what does happen, though, and why it's so easy for us to surrender to the American archive, is I think what often happens, we will say that the idea of African history begins when the colonizer arrives. Right? So it becomes quite easy for us to then say anything modern, anything that's shaped modernity across the world is a result of the external, right? But I think there's a quick story I want to tell you that several years ago, a group of young South Africans, maybe between ages 14 and 16, went to the foundation to ask President Mbeki, why is it that Africans have always been seen and perceived as victims across the world? And his answer was, but are you sure they've been victims? And he says, if you look at the Haitian revolution in the late 1700s, early 1800s, these Haitian people who were first-generation Africans fight against the French. They become the first independent Black Republic of Haiti. They fought off and held off the Spanish, the French, and the British. they ensure that the French no longer have a way of taking over the US. The second example becomes around, now say, 1876 or so, with the Battle of Isandlwana. The Battle of Isandlwana is a battle between AmaZulu, the Zulu people in South Africa, against the British. Now, this comes about in a long history of battles in South Africa, but the AmaZulu nation fight off and they beat the British.
So let me turn
one last one. The third one is the Battle of Adwa in Ethiopia. In the Battle of Adwa, again, you see these Africans who fight off the Europeans and these victorious people. What happens in the end, and I'll stop here, is that when we continue to conceive these Africans as these victims, it becomes so easy for us to surrender the global archive and say it's their archive and not our archive.
Fantastic point. So, Suvir, now, what is it that is happening in your judgment as a columnist of considerable repute, as a thinker and opinion maker? We're pulling you out of the kitchen for a minute. What is it in your judgment, the American narrative, now that you've left America for some time and you've looked at the media landscape very closely, and media, I don't mean mass media, but all across?
So I came into India 5 years ago, and I came with an American narrative, having been an American story of some success, and I land in India feeble and almost ready to pass away, and I live to tell the tale. What I saw in India were young kids who were reaching out to me in social media, Instagram and Twitter and wherever they could reach out to somebody they didn't know. And what they showed me was an India that was proud of India, that was sharing its own stories, that was making up new stories about its own past stories, and that India I hadn't grown up in. My mind was still colonized by the colonizers, and my history books, my books on geography, my language books were all telling me the narrative that colonizers had left behind, and we were being fed. So the young kids I mentor today are very different from me. They've lived in an India that hasn't seen much strife in the last couple of decades. Their India is a lofty India, which will connect to the world at its own terms. And they are cooking, dressing, creating apps, and being people like I'd never seen in my youth in India.
They don't even read Indian languages, most of them. Their parents speak to them in the language which the Brits taught us. And their knowledge of Indian history, mythology, is sometimes very fashionably unaware and don't care.
I would beg to differ. I think they speak no language very well because that's part of being the social media generation. But they're very together about Indian identity, the storytelling, history, culture, religion, that they're very good at. So today, my shoes, my pajamas that you were making fun of, and my jacket have all been made in India with Indian fabric by Indian tailors, sold in small shops across India, and they're proudly Indian. And I think our Prime Minister has made India a nation very proud of itself, and it's showing with the younger generation, really taking the storytelling to a brisk level of pride, of connecting with one another, and language barriers have been dropped. They speak in hybrid languages that connect them to all Indian at one time.
So India, Armenia, South Africa, we have a panel here which is like clear that there is a hope for narratives which are not necessarily Americanized. And therefore, the sort of layered and nuanced narrative is already taking place within communities that are cohesive and hopefully will spill over and get over the English language barrier. So there's consensus here for that part. I wish there was a true blue American here who probably can rise and say, look, guys, I mean polite, but that's not happening.
Well, it's definitely happening. And I think what I heard from these wonderful people up here is that it makes you stronger. It's a beautiful thing. And culture isn't the flimsy, mamsy-pamsy part of a 3-day conference. This is serious stuff. This is what holds you steady in turbulent times. And it's how you get to know people in other parts of the world. Why should we not know about South Africa and the times before and the stories that you would have chosen in the archive? I think that's vital.
So let me push this a bit. How much can you tell us about Armenia?
What do you remember?
If her narrative has already reached somewhere, you would know something. And meanwhile, don't prepare yourself for thundering speech on South Africa. I'm not going to ask you that.
I would love to give it.
So you're just brutal towards me. I think the genocide, right? So that
Which the world is tried to forget.
Yeah, and that's why I thought, let me pull up that one. So I think it's an important one to not forget about Armenia.
Thank you.
And stuffed grape leaves, stuffed cabbage leaves, and beautiful food, meatballs.
I'm cooking for you next time, not you for me.
Suvir is a risk taker. Okay, so let's make a segue to storytelling. How can we be better storytellers of civilizations that were discussed in a few minutes, but they date back to thousands of years? So what is it in the craft that can be possibly accentuating what you guys just said in the first half?
I mean, so the craft is open, and the canvas allows us to tell the story, right? So if you think about the way African music is moving across the world, from Afrobeats to Amapiano and other forms of music, that's us telling our stories, right? And I think what often happens, we are thinking because it's this entertainment that there isn't an element of storytelling there. But I think there is also a need beyond music, dance, cuisine, and also to think about it in very hard terms as well. Are we building the necessary institutions? Are we writing the necessary books? Are we digitizing them and all these things? I think there's a need for us to be able to not just storytell in one form, but in multiple different ways, making sure that our cultures, our ideas, our thoughts are also conveyed in all these different ways.
So would the world of RNNs and CNNs, which is basically not the channel, but concurrent neural networks and recurrent neural networks, help in this process where African music, as an illustrative example, or Armenian music, is intelligible to people, not just for the beat, but for the words as well? Is the world coming with the coming in of AI, is it going to be more inclusive than we have lived in the pre-internet or even the internet age? Is AI a great cohesive factor in the making, Lara?
I don't know if AI is, but other platforms definitely are. So what I see in Armenia today is genius level work by young people on video game design. So game design, animation using historical figures and mythical heroes from our past. Or that, the Armenian alphabet is actually sacred to us. The letters are sacred. And so what children are doing now, moving the letters around and creating beautiful artwork out of them. So I think digital tools in general, absolutely. And then AI, hopefully on the discoverability and the archive. And I think it's important. I loved how you termed it, this archive. And so what we know of ourselves as a species, being better preserved, it should be helpful even to the little.
Simultaneous translation is nearly almost 95% accurate. So I meant that when I said AI, not some technical tool.
I think institution building, Rohit, when we go to cooking schools in India, just about including Armenia, any nation in the world, we are taught French, Northern European, outdated cooking, that the people living in those countries won't eat anymore. And schools across the world are teaching that in university, where chefs go and get training. Till all the countries that are not from the global south don't have a revolution of just taking pride in their own cuisines, not cuisine, but cuisines within their boundaries, that narrative won't be changed.
Well, so remind the audience that 3 years back, Suvir Saran spoke passionately about the need for not just a Michelin list for Africa, but a list of African cuisine and restaurants, which makes sense to the consumer. Not necessarily through a prism or a lens of Michelin.
No, we should have, still people take pride in their own cuisines, their own cultures, as you said. We need to create new institutions that look at the nations that are building them through their own lens, not another person's lens, another nation's lens. That has to happen. And I think it's begun. In India, I'm seeing some of it.
Let me just focus now the remaining minutes with us on how, so that the audience can either get provoked or learn something which is at the intersection of you guys, the expertise you have.
So, for me, what I'm wearing today is from young designers and one very famous store, Good Earth. It's a homegrown brand that's investing in old Indian ways. The vegetable dyes, hand-spun cotton has been used by them to make clothing that's 21st century. They use no American English jargon in their advertising. They use Sanskrit words to promote the fashion styles they promote every season. That's the beginning. That when you saw me come in, you had a little sneer, you were making fun of my pajamas. Indians are making fun of their own clothing. We call it ethnic, we call it, vernacular. That is changing, and these brands are helping us get there because they are making it aspirational, they're making it... See, we're ready to fight here. But we have to have more of these brands grow. And I think that in India, we're seeing a big change. There's a sea of change happening with youngsters.
Right. So wear your identity with greater deal of self-confidence and pride and send an invoice to Fab India at the end of it. Lara.
I'll approach this as an American journalist. I think that there is so much room for content, media, successful media content, celebrating the heroes of this Renaissance. It is fundamentally interesting stuff. And if you take the time to write about it and videographer it, I think there's a huge opportunity. And you'll also, through the prism of human stories, see this happening. And guess what? People in the world want to hear about other people in the world. So very often this narrow focus on, God bless, white Western culture to the exclusion of others is a choice made in the newsroom. It's a choice, an editorial choice. But there is demand.
Give us a short story on Armenia, which typically the first word that might strike many people would be troubled, in distress, beautiful country. Tell us a story which really has got traction so that people can learn about it.
What do I choose? You're killing me. Survivors. We build and build and build, no matter what. We are the people who keep building, no matter what comes our way. And I think that's incredible. I'm about to put a woman on stage next week who revived ancient herbal medicine and turned it into a high-end cosmetics company, growing at high elevation, because that's where we've always lived, and understanding the chemical, she's a physicist, the chemical composition that is different because she grew that rose at that elevation in that terroir. And she's turned it into an organic cosmetics line. And she's a hero. And she moved to even more compelling. She moved there with her husband to do it together. He left her for another woman. She stayed and built the company. This is all kinds of interesting. As a journalist...
Is this on your IG or your Twitter or your Facebook or your LinkedIn?
I gotta make time. I'm putting it on stage next week, and it should be, frankly. I would like to write a book about this. I grew up in America, in New York. I'm a New Yorker. But my parents always, and for generations and generations, doing this work, and I bet it applies to you, and I know it applies to you. In Armenian, you would say, Azgin korzagane. They do the work of a nation. They do the work of a people. And I want to write a book called The Work of a Nation, talking about these people who come hell or high water, conflict or no conflict. They are out there planting those seeds and processing that essential oil and actually using formulas from the 15th century, the Ottoman Palace's Armenian physician's recipe book for purified rose oil.
Got it.
That's
so
incredible.
We got the drift. Now, how does...
You asked, you got it.
How does... is there a problem in your mind on using American social platforms to accentuate what she just said?
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, we can't surrender archives and platforms that we've all collectively built. Right? If we were to say, I'm not interested in the idea of universities, when the University of Timbuktu in the 1100s helped to shape the idea of universities in Europe, and I said, no, not at all. We helped to build them, and so we must utilize them as much as we can. And so I certainly don't come from that school of thought. I'm certainly one that says there is a need for us to tell our own narratives, but not only just consume our own narratives. We must tell our narratives, consume other narratives, because the idea of this global world means that the idea of saying, I'm going to repeat it one last time, the idea of saying that human rights is a European concept is fundamentally incorrect. Right? Those are things that we were collectively doing across the world, in the global south, and in the exchange of things, in the salt routes, the multiple other ways across the world, these things moved around the world. If you think about music, when the slaves of West Africa and East Africa moved to the Caribbean, they moved to the US, they essentially take their way of understanding music, take their way to understand culture, to make jazz music that shapes rock music, that all these things begin to happen. So to then say in the end, no, that's an American platform, hell no, that's our platform, and we must make the most of it.
So whenever you speak next, don't speak of music, because then there will be complete agreement that this is happening. But thereafter, I think starts the main issue. Yes, Suvir.
You know, with the G20 India connection, Vasudevaya Kutumbakam, a verse from our ancient Sanskrit texts, one world, one people, one future. That's what Hinduism has forever championed. And in all our books that expound those virtues, the world is one big connection. But I think till we are happy individually, happy in our own little silos within a nation, and we connect to all the other silos that make that nation, we'll never be part of a global world. So I think we need to first identify who we are, be proud of our own identities, make peace with our neighbors and their different versions of that common identity, and then become the sea of shining stars that come together as a world. And I think India is doing it with that. The Sanskrit expression, Vasudevaya Kutumbakam, is giving more of these young kids like Vardhan a belief in that India can be a global player, be at peace with itself, within its own borders, and make peace with the world at large, and lead the world to a better future.
So how much of it is that we are trying to project Indian, Armenian, South African narratives? How much are we even listening to each other within the global South? That is a matter that...
I don't think it's projection. I think we're just being. And we've been absent for so long that it feels like an act of defiance or maybe an extra push, but it's just being who we are. Knowing Hindu philosophy has changed my life. It has strengthened my life in the hardest times. Knowing Soweto Gospel Choir, went back to or knowing about Ubuntu has changed my life, has strengthened my life. That's evidence enough for me personally that this is working. Whatever the world has set up now for the spreading of that narrative and that knowledge, it's enriching.
I think Rohit has a very deep point here, that we may be at peace with who we are, we still need to hear each other. Because I think there's so much noise coming from the people who've owned the storytelling narratives of the past, that he's right in saying we need to make a lot more noise and hear each other before we are completely just fractured and still struggling.
Noise or sense, actually. Sense is what might be on your mind.
Better word.
Because the noise part is, in any case, there. So maybe we'll open this up right away. And this panel exudes hope. This panel talks of interconnectivity in a manner that probably has been on our mind. But have we overdone it? Is there someone who believes that this is actually too much being said too fast? Or we have a consensus and we can leave?
Happy with consensus.
Is the American narrative short-lived? Ambassador, is it fair for me to ask you if you could share from your unique vantage point the fact that the narratives have actually changed considerably from the context that you just heard, sir? I'm putting you in the
hot seat here.
While he's getting ready then, can I give you another example? Architecture, right? So if you think about the architects we have at the moment who come from the African continent, like I said, David Ajay, Sumaya Valley, Francis Kere, what they're beginning to do at the moment is to show how these pre-colonial communities were building in ways that are so important for the climate. So if you think at the work that Francis Kere is doing from Burkina Faso and David Ajay, they're using rammed earth material. So if you've ever been in these huts, when it's hot outside, they're cool. When it's cool, they're warm. Right? And this is the necessary and appropriate response to the kind of climate we're in at the moment. So this is yet another example of these narratives.
And completely unrelated to music.
Yeah.
Get you.
No, where I come from, in the defense and national security space, what you did to me would be called an ambush. But be that as it may, I think we live in a world of competing narratives. And the success that we, as the panel has proved, particularly in the Global South, can achieve is by ensuring that despite the odds of certain narratives being stacked against us, we are able to make proper use of the tools for disseminating such narratives, which are generally speaking owned by countries not of the global south.
Yeah, exactly as you said. We have to still use them and use them to our advantage.
Yeah, and I personally think that India is a country that can help the world come together, heal together, because it's always followed this philosophy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. I mean, this is not to say that other countries do not have that kind of broad vision of, seeing the world as one family. But India is particularly well placed during its G20 presidency to bring people together.
Yes. My name is Amit, founder EasyGolf. So we wish to tell our story before colonization and our own narratives. But where? In the platform controlled by the American digital monopoly, where our youth spent most of the time. Whatever content the country wish to publish, they can decide in your country what to show through algorithm. How can we get control back to the digital platform?
Right. So you're bringing some perspective to all the spontaneity and cheer that our three panelists brought.
No, which is true. The algorithm part is so true.
But you guys
They can
just wished it away.
No, but I think we still need to fight it. But we have to make we have to keep sharing our messages there.
There are so many ways to break through. I've studied information architecture passively and directly, and how you, first of all, collect community and build audience. There are ways to do it. It's not a lost cause.
Yeah, if many of us do it, they can't silence all of us.
Yeah, you build your own platform. It's not, you work through other lines of trust and lines of, the platforms aren't everything.
That's the point we seem to have flagged now.
So our lives aren't only digital though, right? And I think what often happens is I might find someone initially on Twitter. And it's not, and over time, I will then experience them beyond just Twitter. And I think part of the reason I'm stuttering a bit, because I take the question very seriously. I think it's an important question. But I think part of it is to not surrender the power for us to continue speaking, right? Yeah. But then beyond that, then I think the conversation we're having, I think earlier in the week, about how do you utilize technologies coming out of India, how do you utilize technologies that come out of other parts of the world that are more interested in more public digital goods, and how do you utilize it?
That's well said. However, there is Twitter and there is coup in India, and I don't think too many people here, I don't want to embarrass anybody, use coup, or if they do, they've logged in, but they don't use it. So it is a tall and a long sort of...
There's an art and a science, though. If you know the audience you want to build, you can fetch them from the platforms and pull them somewhere else. There are lots of ways to go around this dilemma.
Good. So we have a sense of optimism about the way you had three case studies in stars who think that it's going to shine brighter. Interconnectedness is another theme. And I think from what ambassadors have said, I think each of the 19 countries have enough being said on the world being, one family. So clearly, while India has articulated it so well and persistently, the other countries are also interested in probably coming together under the big tent of one family, considering the kind of crisis that stares us, including, say, climate. So we have for you this panel even after this discussion is over. But do try and build your communities with greater fervor, because Suvir and Lara will certainly retweet it immediately. And thank you very much for being here. And here on, back to you. Thank you.